let's head to Dublin, Ireland. That's right, it's a game between Florida State and Georgia Tech. Now, this one's been played hundreds, if not thousands of times already in the College Football 25 video game, but now it's almost time to play it for real. The ACC clash will take place in Dublin for reasons unknown to me, but it adds a little extra flavor to a Week 0 slate in need of it. So let's welcome in our friend, Brendan Sonnone of Noles 24/7. Brendan, I laid it out. It's really the most neutral of neutral site games, right? Whether that's travel, time change, new environment, somehow getting 85 plus passports together, whatever it is. Tell us, what is the impact of this game being in Ireland?
So you mentioned the passports. Yes, that's been years in the making for FSU to get ready for the logistics for this game. It's been quite complicated, according to Mike Norvell, but they're wheels up this evening. They're taking off on Wednesday evening. Will arrive in Dublin sometime Thursday morning, Irish time. I think Irish Standard Time is what it is. It's like a 5-hour difference from the East Coast. So they'll be landing around like 10 o'clock Thursday morning Irish time and getting ready for doing a practice pretty like shortly after they land, actually, to kind of try to get on schedule and get used to the game time over there with the time change. So that's a dynamic that's interesting that FSU is trying to deal with it, as is Georgia Tech. You did know, Emily, that Florida State, or that there's not like a home field advantage, you would think. But I think this is going to end up being a pretty lopsided attended game with a lot of FSU fans there. I'm not sure that Georgia Tech is going to have quite as many people at FSU, thinking it'll be a quote-unquote pseudo home game is what I've been told. So it'd be interesting to see if that materializes, but I think FSU is pretty confident with the turnout that they're going to have compared to their opponent for this game. How that turns out in terms of like crowd noise and whatnot, I have no idea, but an interesting dynamic to follow along with this weekend.
Good to know. Let's talk about the play on the field. So for Florida State, as it's been well documented, they lost their leading passer, rusher, receiver to All-Americans on the defensive side of the ball. So where is Mike Norvell's confidence level for this really new-looking team headed into 2024?
Yeah, they do lose a lot. You can't argue that. That's for sure. Florida State does return a handful of veterans with a lot of experience and all ACC type of accolades. Darius Washington was a first-team All-ACC left tackle last year. He's been awesome in camp. Patrick Payton was an All-ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year a couple years ago. He's kind of the running mate to Jared Verse the last couple seasons. He's stepping into a bigger role. And there's a few other guys that kind of fit that same mold of having been good before, and now you're being asked to take over the All-American type of candidates for the Jordan Travises, the Jared Verses, those type of guys. And obviously no easy task, but something that kind of Mike Norvell prides himself in is that there's a lot of development within the program. And that's kind of what's interesting about this season is there is a lot of raw talent. There's a lot of new faces from the transfer portal, about a dozen or so pieces who've been brought in from premier programs across the country. A lot of underclassmen who had some decent roles like on special teams and rotational spots last year that they're expecting a lot out of. One thing Mike Norvell has been pretty consistent with is that this is, and it's been since the spring, that this is probably the strongest and fastest team he's had on paper with like the GPS tracking and off-field like performance stuff they monitor since he's been at Florida State from top to bottom. Now, how does that manifest itself in wins and on-field play? That's going to depend on how guys step up into those new roles. But Mike Norvell does seem pretty relaxed about this team. Seems confident what he has. I think he's legitimately excited to see how new players step up in those new roles. That's going to be another dynamic that's going to be really interesting to follow this season.
Being faster certainly can't hurt, so that is definitely a good sign. One of those newcomers, DJ Uiagalelei, comes back to the ACC. I know everybody has that October 5th date circled on their calendar for the revenge game with Clemson, but overall, what are expectations for him this year?
High, like legitimately high expectations. And I think there's this interesting disconnect from those in the college football world and then those more isolated Florida State, and also some of those in East Lansing who saw what DJ Uiagalelei did. Now the Michigan State staff was when they were at Oregon State and saw a player legitimately ascend and develop from his time at Clemson. FSU internally has been really pleased with his development since spring practice. They like what he did in the spring. They thought he really carried it over well into camp. Back in the spring, they were talking about him being ahead of schedule. I think that kind of still stands. Like they know what they have with him. He's been really sharp in preseason practice, minimized turnovers. That's something that he did last year as well at Oregon State. And again, internally, like they think he's a guy you can win a lot of games with. Now, what that looks like statistic-wise, I'm not sold that DJ Uiagalelei is going to be a Heisman candidate or anything like that. Even all ACC, I'm not sure, but I think he's going to be solid. I think he can minimize turnovers, and I think he's going to be able to give you a lot in the downfield passing game as well as the running game, which is something that I think a lot of people kind of sleep on with him. He's 255 pounds, but moves well at that size and quite powerful as well. He'll be part of the rushing attack too. So yeah, they like what he can do. They think he brings a lot of maturity and a pretty diverse skill set as well.
I will give the general college football public a bit of a slide here because those Oregon State games were very late at night, so they didn't get to see him, but he was fantastic last year, and you can check the stats as well. Let's talk about, on the other side, Georgia Tech does return its leading passer, its leading rusher, and leading receiver from last season. So looking at the Yellow Jackets, what challenges will they bring on Saturday?
Yeah, it's that offense, especially the skill talent. I think in a vacuum, I'm not sure I would take Georgia Tech's skill talent over Florida State's, but I think it's pretty close. You probably convince me if that would not be the craziest thing in the world. Yeah, Haynes King is a really fun quarterback, a little like sporadic at times. He's got some like daredevil to him. He throws a lot of interceptions, but the good's really good. He pushes the ball downfield, runs a lot. I think he had like 700, 800 yards rushing last year. That's complemented with a 1,000-yard running back who was a converted wide receiver, and Jamal Haynes. Like they have legitimate weapons on the outside as well. So that's like, to me, if this game on Saturday ends up being close, I think it's because Georgia Tech turns it into somewhat of a shootout and can manufacture some points early on in the game when FSU's defense is still trying to find its footing a little bit. Like they're capable. I think they rushed for 200 yards against Georgia last year. This is a team that can find ways to move the ball. I really respect what Brent Key's done there in a short amount of time. And yeah, if this is a close game, it's because that offense did something pretty well.
Yeah, a lot of those rushing yards coming from their quarterback. So we had some fun with this. We simulated the game 20 times on the College Football 25 video game. We showed some highlights at the beginning of the segment. And Georgia Tech did pull out the win 3 times in those simulations. So if that were to happen in the real game, you mentioned how it might be close, but how would they get it done and pull off the upset?
So I think the shootout method is probably like it ends up being a couple of things. I think Florida State's going to be able to control the game for the most part. They're so strong in the trenches on both sides of the ball. But if Georgia Tech's able to make this a contest and maybe even pull off the upset, I think it's because one, Haynes King protects the football more than he traditionally does, and you get the good version of him, which is a really fun football player. And that would be him spreading the ball around, pushing it vertically. I think they returned 4 of their leading receivers, like all 4 of their leading receivers from last year. They got some legit speed outside. So I think that's like really what we would see is like busted coverages from Florida State's secondary, which is supposed to be a strength for this team, but you're also replacing a starting safety from last year. You're starting nickel corner. You're starting outside corner, Renardo Green, who was a 2nd-round draft pick. Like you're missing 3 starters from the secondary, and even though it's really talented, like there's a chance for miscommunications. If Georgia Tech capitalizes on that and is able to win vertically a few times, like it could end up becoming a game that you're trying to score points at a high volume if you're Florida State. And I don't think that's what Florida State's built to do this season. I think they want to do ground and pound type of football, win off of play action stuff with DJ Ongale's arm. They don't want this to be a ball game that gets into the 30s. That's how Georgia Tech would win.
Okay, for that not to happen, let's end here. What's the biggest key for the Noles to start 1-0?
I think the main thing is going to be so cliche, but like you got to be able to run the football well. And part of that is that's what Florida State is designed to do. They return a majority of their starters on the offensive line. It's a hulking offensive line, too. Multiple guys over 330 pounds. I mentioned Darius Washington earlier. Maurice Smith at center is a 4th-year starter now. He's been around since 2019. He was there before Mike Norvell was. So was Darius Washington. And both of them have had really good preseason camps, but you bring in some transfers from the SEC to kind of sprinkle in there and help out with the beef along the offensive line. Roydo Williams, you bring in at running back from Alabama. We return Lawrence Toafili, who has been just a very steady, like dual threat type of running back for you the last couple of years. He's been awesome in camp. And so running the football is something that you're built to do. And Georgia Tech was awful at stopping the run last year. They brought in a new defensive coordinator, so we'll see what that looks like. But they were 130th nationally in yards per carry last year. I don't know how that gets rectified over the span in one season. Like I'm just not sure. So if you're able to win this game, it's because you're able to run the ball and do so consistently and get back on track. Last year's rushing attack for FSU was okay by their standards. It wasn't as good as 2022, and they think they have made some nice personnel changes in the offseason to kind of get back on track there. And I think Saturday will be a pretty good litmus test. If you can run the ball on Georgia Tech, you're probably feeling pretty good that you can, kind of build on that moving forward.
All right, we'll see. Not that you needed to sell any of us on this game. We are all starved for college football games. It's officially happening. Week 0 is here. Brendan, thank you so much for breaking down that game for us. As always, you can check out more of his work at Noles247.com. Also, our team site over at GoJackets.com for all things Georgia Tech. These are your sites not just for this big game, but for all the games, all season long.